So how do you deal with the fact that in some cases, the people you're designing for all think they are, in some sense, designers, and they have an emotional stake in having the power to say, oh no, you should do it this way, you know, I want green background, or whatever it is. It's usually something fairly superficial.
So,
Stupid.
yeah, no, but I mean, I mean, it really goes back to the first question, I think, as well. This of, you know, how do you sell people on your ideas? I've come to a point, and this is answering part of your question. I'll go back and invite my colleagues to chime in as well. That I do the best I can, and I give them what it is that I think is the best I can do, and whatever they decide to do with it is up to them. Technically, there's not much more that can be done than that, assuming that I still get paid, of course. But you know, when these kind of energies get activated, you're in a different world. It's not you and that other person. It's these two kind of archetypal forces battling it out. You know, who's the hero, and I think a lot of it's a process of the capacity, the willingness and ability to reflect on what's going on in the moment. And if you notice this is happening, I mean, you can say something, wow, you know, I don't really think you're reflecting on, you know, how it is that you're approaching this situation, but then you get fired, right? So I don't know if there is a real answer other than just doing the best that you can. And if you're happy with what it is you've done, then it's up to them to do the best they can with it. At the same time, if they're asking you to make all of these changes and you're being paid, then that's your job. One of the things I've noticed is that a lot of people go into design because they wanted to be artists, okay? And what happens is design is an art. Design is, I may not like it, but if you like it, then that's good design. I'm boiling it down here, but art is the opposite. I may like the art that I created, but if you don't, who cares? So don't confuse personal creativity in that artistic, that intrinsic sense with personal creativity as something extrinsic that you're giving to someone else. It doesn't really answer your question, but I'm not sure that there is a question other than one other small thing is if there's an advocate, always seek out the advocate, and hopefully the advocate is above the person who's giving you a hard time. But without an advocate, I mean, many organizations want to change without changing, and the people who say they want change are the ones who want to change the least. Everything else can change except for them. There's enormous amount of irony in the world right now, not just in Brooklyn.
Was there any other additional feedback?
In terms of how, I think a little education goes a long way. I think it's important to partner up with your project angel or your support on the other side, on the client side. Also, testing goes a long way. You know, you can show them, this doesn't really work, and here's some, like, again, go back to the facts, go back to the data, because design can be very subjective. So what you want to do is support that with as much research and as much data and as much testing as you can, and also educate your client as well. Part of that is a little give and take. I mean, they are your client. Like you said, you're getting paid to do it. They are the feedback mechanism, but you also want to try and guide them the best way that you can. And education helps a lot in that area.
And that's a really good point, that just grabbing your laptop, going out, showing it to somebody, recording a little bit of it, showing them, you know, vomiting because it's so horrible, and going back and showing that to people can have an enormous amount of effect. I find in those situations, you know, the question is the person more quantitative or qualitatively oriented? Do they want to see people not liking it, or do they want numbers that prove it? So getting an idea of which of those things the person is going to convince the person is very helpful. Sometimes they want to say, you know, 6 out of 10 people we tested didn't like this background. Or they might just want one person going like, oh my God, you know, lime green, that's just not going to work. So getting, and I think that's, yeah, I think that could be helpful.
Yeah, one thing I would like to add here, something that, so my experience, because it may, basically, it may answer your, you know, questions directly or indirectly, but what I observed is in so long working in my experience in my agencies, there are many of these situations comes. The way, suppose, I know design is never perfect, right? It's never 100% perfect. You know, most of the people say you like your design, and some people don't. So there is always a fight between these, you know, you end up, you know, trying to basically prove that, you know, your ego or whatever that comes along the way. I mean, when it comes to that kind of a teaching mode, I think that repels. So when you are in the form of a collaborative or some kind of a discussion mode, then we can ease down those things. Otherwise, you know, when we come, oh, I'm a UX guy, let me teach you how to do this in the right way, then the real becomes a very complicated issue. So I think we try not to teach, but rather make them realize, make them feel, and then have that collaboration mindset and, of course, discussion, you know, brainstorming, and that helps a lot.
There was another audience question.
Sure. Two questions, actually. Maybe actually a little bit of three. Number one, Leala, your presentation you said has been given many times. Is there a place to get a copy or see it?
The old one?
Oh,
Oh, it's so dated, which is why I was like, I'm just going to show a couple slides. It's pretty dated, which is funny to say that I gave it in 2008 and now it's very dated. But yeah, I think it is a couple places. I think Henry Stewart has it. It was given at Creatosphere. I'll have to figure out where I scrolled those things away at. But
the one big question I had was you talk very much, you know, looking at UX. Some of the points you pointed out were great and amazing and really interesting. My big question to you is, how do you manage diametrically opposed UX requirements? So for you know, a lot of the sites you're talking about are websites and other parts and pieces. A lot of the asset management systems, I should say some of the asset management systems, really work on the back end, on the production people doing the workflows. And if you look at those workflows, you have some very disparate groups wanting to do inside of a single system. So, you know, for argument's sake, somebody who is an artist and very artistic is going to work very differently than a researcher, a statistician, or a producer, or a writer. And I guess my big question is, you know, your focus is talking about how you analyze UX. Part of my question is, how do you mesh UX?
In the usability study that I did at the Met, it was actually really interesting. And it was interesting because when they bought the system, they didn't really talk to the real users. They decided that the user base was a small core group of curators. When what was actually found, and this gets to the diversity of the users, what was actually found is that it cut across many different levels of, it was the administrator, it was the secretary, it was the researcher in the library, and in terms of kind of pooling all of those together, you do the usability study so you can try and capture as many commonalities as possible, because that's the primary need that you want to serve. It's kind of like the low-hanging fruit. It's like, everybody wants this, let's make sure this is served. And then you have things on the outlying fringe that are very discipline specific, that are maybe only a core group of power users, which is why you find out who those people are as well, because you also need to serve them. And many times, in some cases I've seen that that's met via giving them a different interface. You don't want to present your power user with this flashy thing that takes them forever with all the advanced features hidden. Okay, so you want to make sure that your digital asset management system that you purchase or you buy or you put into place or you build has very diverse looks to it in terms of it can serve many different needs. So for your power users, you want to enable them with giving them programmatic things that they can do that are already built into the system. So you add on to sort of that admin interface and provide them with these quick, easy tools that they can use to accomplish their goals and whatever that they need to do. So you present a different face. You provide more of a web UI for the casual user, the casual researcher, and you give the more administrative heavy, the more advanced features to your power users. And you do that through rules and permissions and through roles and permissions and kind of setting up the system in such a way that it serves all these different people. It's a hard balance, but you want to serve the commonalities first, because you don't really build around exceptions, because it's not very you can't leverage that going forward. It's not very stable to proceed that way. So that's the best short answer I can give you on that. It's hard, very hard.
So in the last two questions I've heard, the audience may vary, just like the roles, to your point, may vary. because you're going to have different roles who care about different things. Like to your point, a power user cares a lot more about detail and advanced features than a secretary or a curator, possibly, where one may want to see more metadata versus the other, et cetera, things like that. So curating it that way and making sure the system can see what it's supposed to show that specific audience, where you actually design the system or lay it out and implement it so it shows what they actually care about. I think that might get more user adoption too.
Yeah, I would say that user needs and organizational goals are what drive a functional specification, and then that becomes the frame, the container in which design decisions are made. So identifying up front, to your point, what are the user needs, and then what are the organizational goals? Because sometimes, and it doesn't sound like in this example, but the organizational goals and user needs conflict. Sometimes you're optimizing towards pushing people towards something that maybe they don't actually want to go towards, but you're trying to sell them something, for example. But for me, the simplest way of thinking about design is user needs, organizational goals lead to a functional specification, which then drives the design of a service interface. And that service interface is always human to human, human to computer, or a hybrid, a little bit of both. That's, to me, the simplest way of thinking about a design process. But the constraints, I think the user needs and the organizational goals become the constraints which drives the design. And so if people are like, well, what about blah, 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 you could say like, all right, well, how does that meet a user need or an organizational goal? And if it doesn't, then it goes into the parking lot for perhaps future versions.
The parking lot is a nice place. Many things. You mentioned functional specs, and I want to spend a minute on functional specs just because I think it's important. It's how you add sort of a quantitative assessment of a particular need, business need, user goal. And you go through the process of when you're, speaking with the client or the customer or the vendor or whoever, and you go through that and you assign a number, like is this a level of difficulty? And then you get a really good picture of the things that are going to be really hard to do from a development point of view, because that's like a level 5. It's like, ooh, this is going to be tough. And then you have this really low-hanging fruit. You give it like a level 1. It's like, can people put things in their shopping cart? Yay, 1. But things like, can people combine shopping carts for multiple logins? Ooh, 6, And this gives you a really good picture of the level of difficulties and sort of the challenges that are going to be involved by doing a functional spec. It's a great document to have. It again, like having the whole picture. It's like usability study, check. Functional specs, check. You got to make sure that you have all these pieces. It's much, much harder now than it used to be. You have to have all these people there to do these things, or you have to wear many hats and accomplish them for your organization just to do that. So it's also challenging, but functional specs is a good one.
It's interesting that you identify user versus organization, because in some senses my question is exactly that. What happens when the user UX and the organizational UX are completely diametrically opposed?
Yeah,
So literally you've got people who like chaos and people who want to bring order to chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got artists and users, and you've got complete different right brain, left brain people. I mean, you get right on the head to say that ends up in a functional spec, but a functional spec is really just a does it do this or not. And
well, I think a functional
it's all
spec,
about UX.
a functional spec can be used to manage expectations, I think. On the other side, it's a huge question, but for me, the organizational goals always trump the user needs. And I'll give you an example. If I'm opening up a library and my users say they want a McDonald's in that library, every single one of them want that. If that doesn't meet an organizational goal, then it doesn't matter whether that's what they want or not, because I'm not going to do it. I think a lot of organizations make the mistake of giving users everything that they perceive that they need, rather than saying, how does this achieve an organizational goal? And then once you give somebody something, there's always that one person that wants it forever. And then you wind up providing an enormous amount of support for, something that nobody actually uses. So I think that is, so it's being less reactive to user needs and mapping them to organizational goals. I think, and that's, you could say that's the battle between the right and the left brain, right? The right brainers are like, we want this, we want that, we want this, we want that. The left brainers hopefully are like, okay, but that needs to fit into a system that works. And the right brain is like, what do you mean? It's just all abstract, it's all associative. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
So how do you weed out the 1%? Do you poll them? Do you do more user testing than testing one person, obviously?
Just shoot them.
Yeah.
That's one way.
You're in a bad spot if they're the primary decision maker. That's also really important, is knowing sort of the organizational structure and who's signing the line at the end of the day and who holds the right to be able to make those decisions, because that is the primary need. You've done your best to try and lead them in a good direction, but if you can't, so you're not always going to be successful.
Was there another question?
I had a question about your presentation.
Sure.
Thanks for making it. I did not understand what cloud UX is. What is that?
Okay,
What
this
is cloud UX?
cloud UX is actually like more of a service. Now you see the concept of the cloud coming up pretty much, I think, in the last couple of years. It's becoming very popular about the cloud concept. Cloud typically, I think, is like works more like an service that is centralized in certain places, right? So you can basically use this. What I talked about the cloud concept is a concept which basically is coming from Human Factor International. And this company basically comes with this concept like how you can leverage all these, basically the UX elements, through the cloud system by developing a system and application that can basically, it's more like a network. Okay, so all these objects that you have, that we talked about, the object-oriented kind of a UX, you put these objects into it, say a persona or as some kind of a profile or scenarios, case studies. You can develop those things and put it in the cloud, and you can share in a network with the peoples. So some of these are like paid services, some are free, So you can make use of these as a centralized kind of a system, and everybody can participate and do the things that they do individually otherwise. Because organizations, UX is like pretty much, very much, contained inside the organizations, but it's not shared. But now it's a kind of a concept that is going to be shared in the cloud. So if you have a similar experience, and if you can map that and put it as a kind of an object, the other person can also use it. Hey, there is a concept, suppose for example, a company A develops some kind of a idea about, they develop some personas or some kind of a scenarios that can be used by another company. Of course, this is complicated in certain areas, and of course, in terms of the copyrights and all those things, or some kind of, say when you talk about some of the securities issues, right, that has to be taken care of. But to an extent, you can use these objects, you can number of times, so that you don't have to develop from scratch. So it's just kind of an infrastructure. The object-oriented kind of an approach combined together with the infrastructure of the cloud, and that gives you that entire whole concept. Does that answer your question?
We can talk about it.
Yes. I know there's a lot of things to discuss about it, from
We
the
just need the cloud as a server.
Yeah.
That's it. So Google Docs, a shared Google Doc could be
Yeah.
a cloud, and you could type in, I like this dropdown.
Yeah.
And that could be a cloud UX.
Yeah.
Or it could be you have Twitter Bootstrap, which is a series of user interface elements that
Yeah.
are distributed that can be combined as a framework to scaffold a new interface. So I didn't know so it's a helpful indication.
Yeah, well, we are talking more from the applications point of view as well as from the hardware or networking concept of the cloud. Of course, technically, of course, there are so many things that involves in it. What do you mean by cloud? And exactly, right? So we can talk about that, of course. Anything?
I think your second follow-up clarified that. I was just going to say, actually, keep the user out of where the stuff is and where it's being processed. But you came back and clarified that.
Sure, okay.
It's more of more of an infrastructure question.
Infrastructure, yes.
Because the experience should be the same as sitting next to the guy.
Definitely. Of course, there are a lot of questions people come up. Can you design experience? And there's a big debate about that. You cannot design experience, right? So how do you basically come up with the idea of design if you cannot design experience? It's a human thing, it's a very emotional thing that comes into it. And of course, this is a ongoing debate which is going on. So it's not about right or wrong, but it's all about doing the things what best we could do.
Actually, another question. You talked a lot about responsive design. It's a very powerful concept that everybody seems to be moving towards. But can you give some examples where responsive design does not work, or do you just feel like it is just a new sort of dominant presence for user experience?
Okay. Now, when you talk about responsive design, we have to be very careful about this, because I'll give you a couple of examples about iOS, development platform. Typically, most of the few years back, most people used to develop native, apps, and these native apps are like, pretty much like a thick client. We call it, in our programming term, we call it a thick client. Pretty much, all the applications are sitting in the, device. Now, that concept is now becoming very difficult, because how many devices are there? And how many applications that you want to port it to these applications? Because you have an Android, you have iOS, you have Blackberries, right? Think about it. If you have to keep writing application for each one of these objects, it's a nightmare. So what we are trying to do in this concept is like responsive is pretty much a hybrid kind of a concept, where you make it very light in the client side. And most of these applications at the back end, you process it at the basically in the server side mostly. So there are other, of course, techniques we use, Ajax and many other, techniques to catch it. With HTML5 is much better because it has a caching mechanism, and which, takes away many of the headaches that we do in terms of validations and all that stuff. So the limitations are there. For example, if you are designing a real-time applications, responsive design is not going to be very effective. If I want to measure my heartbeat, or if I want to basically, say a sonogram or something, or medical devices, responsive design is not good for such kind of an applications, because you need real time. So we have to be very careful about where and how we have to implement this, kind of a architecture or design. Pretty much, it's very successfully, we can implement this into e-commerce, kind of a website where you don't need a real-time kind of an experience, right? It's okay to wait for a certain nanoseconds, to do a transactions, but for a heartbeat, you cannot wait for that. You need right away the real-time experience. So it all depends on how, depending, again, it's all the need basis.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a new concept. I mean, television is responsive design, right? I mean, if I put a 13-inch television, if I put a 50-inch television, it's going to adapt. What I think responsive design for the web does now is it separates the mediation from the content, right? And so it says that the content is no longer dependent on the mediation, that the mediation can change, but the content will adapt to the mediation. Right, so it's an old model. It's it's retrieved. In some ways, I think you could connect it to how mainframes used to work. If anyone remembers those, right? You just had a terminal, and it would serve up responsive design to you, right? And so I think we have a lot of different responsive design things that we use in our life. It's just now migrating to the internet. The internet really does a lot of things that have already existed really, really well, right? But even responsive design is something that it's taking from something else and being brought into the into the web. Does that make sense to everyone, right? So first the web was print, then it was television, now there's movies, and so you look at old things being brought into the internet. And so responsive design is a model from other media, other technology that's now working very well, it seems, and I think it has a lot of value for the internet. And what it does is it separates the mediation from the message, right? They're no longer coupled, they're separate.
As a content strategist, that's a very important part, is, I mean, that's what the development of CMS systems and making sure this is all about having structured content, having content types, that this is the components of an article. This is the components of, you know, a biography. This is the components of an editorial piece. But those aren't tied to design anymore. They're actually tied to their structure, so that the CMS system that's being developed understands that, you know, just this is where the content goes. You know, it has an author, it has a body, it might have an image associated with it, and it's not hard-coded into the design like it used to be. It's decoupled from that. So it's free, so it can now appear, you know, on your mobile device, on your iPad, on, you know, on a touch screen interface. It's because the content itself is not changing. It just knows where it needs to go. And in some cases, you develop, you know, certain types of content for particular devices, but then it gets a little complicated. But, you know.
It's pretty much, I was trying to adapt, I mean, fit into this, for example, the kind of design that most people, I mean, what we do in our mobile devices are like pretty much hierarchical kind of thing, you know, long scrolling kind of thing. Whereas, you know, that's how the responsive architecture, when you shrink the screen, right, to that small little screen, how you basically adapt to that screen. And then the informations also may align properly, like, you know, we use this technology like Bootstrap, and many of this concept is a whole total kind of architecture involved in the UI. It was not there before. You know, before this concept was never there, but now the architecture is required. Architecting the entire whole UI layer, it's becoming a very important factor in order to determine whether you're going to use this as a responsive or adaptive. So, so that's the trend which is right now, and more and more you'll see all these websites are having that responsive concept.
So one question for the audience. How many of you have used a DAM before? Great, so it's more than half of you. How many use a DAM today? Okay, so about a dozen of you. How many believe, even today, or do you believe, by show of hands, that UX is lacking in DAM? Same or not the same? Okay. Okay. So now that the solution providers know. And then some more harder questions. So if I'm the business person at an organization, why should I spend money on UX beyond what you've talked? And how much is it going to cost me and how long is it going to take? Because that's what they really care about.
I gave you that $1 to $100 thing.
Right.
So
Good point. Yeah.
if you plan and you have a good strategy and you have UX professionals involved, that $1 spent on paying that UX professional, I wish you could pay them $1. If you don't do it ahead of time, it will, let's say, $100. So just, you know, use that ratio. So it's best to prepare and then design, as opposed to just, well, let's see. And that's a good, you know, and I want to mention something. When you're interviewing your vendors, when I talked about asking them about their philosophies and who they have developing their interfaces, ask them what methodology do they use for their developers. Are they using Agile or are they using Waterfall? There's a big difference there. If they're using Waterfall, it is a much more successful methodology because it allows you to catch those things along the way, to test continually. But, I mean, not Waterfall, I'm Agile. But if you're doing Waterfall, it's really locking you into making these decisions, and then it's hard-coded and it's set in there and there's no iteration there. But those are two very important differing philosophies, and you can almost tell right away whether a system is going to be developed from a really great point of success by just asking that simple question. If they can't answer it, then you've got a more interesting problem on your hands.
And just for the people that don't know PM language, can you explain the 5 versus 3 steps of Agile, or at least the 3 steps?
No,
of
I'm not a developer, so I can't really tell you. But in my work with metadata and taxonomies, and in my work with things like personalization and big data projects, where there's more success when that company has signed on to do Waterfall. And I mean Agile. Why do I keep doing that? It's really like it's in there.
Yeah, Waterfall has been a while.
But
Talk to the psychoanalyst to your left.
I know. It's just, I think I'm angry at the fact that I'm doing a project that's working on Waterfall right now, and it's personalization, which makes it really difficult to you can't move forward until everything is set in stone, and that's really, you have to be able to test along the way and make changes more iteratively.
Well, there's been a lot of talk about UX being about emotion, so perhaps you could tell the person that it'll make the employees happier and see if that works. I think we
Definitely.
probably know the answer to that, but if there's a lot of talk about UX being about emotion, which means it's about positive emotions, then you would have a happier workforce if you employed UX in your business. That's an easy sell, right? That's
right.
Happiness.
It's totally quantifiable.
Yeah, exactly. You know, quantifying emotions. But I think it's, I'm interested in, been some talk about using science to design for emotions. I don't know if anyone out there has a comment about that, because that's kind of frightening to me. I'll just leave it at that, but perhaps somebody has a comment about that.
Yeah, actually, I attended a presentation a couple of weeks ago, and practically there were a variety of different principles that you could design for more happier, joyful experiences. One, looking at bright colors, as opposed to muted, desaturated colors. Curvier, rounder things,
Yeah, that makes sense.
like geometric sans serifs or balloons are much more generally appealing than jaggedy shapes and
Sharp edges.
yeah. I mean, there's many more things, but I think a lot of it comes down to basic psychology from when we were kids and what we liked and what we appreciated. And
So design for children and it'll be okay. That's kind of what we say to some extent.
Design for
right?
positive emotion and joy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think probably aspects of anthropomorphism when you're designing for recognition in human aspects.
Absolutely. You can
Yeah.
create an enormous amount of affect just by having people smiling. I mean, that's a social component of a website, is just people smiling back at you.
Yeah.
It creates an affective connection. It's a relatedness. They're acknowledging you. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's, for example, a primary reason why at ZocDoc they have a lot of faces and caricatures around the website so that it doesn't seem just like a portal to find doctors, but rather you see little caricatures of doctors and you feel, oh, there's people. And
There's life on this website.
There's surgeons and
Right.
there's dentists and chiropractors I can find.
All living inside my computer.
Making faces,
Yeah. Cool. So that helps. I'll buy into some of that. Absolutely.
But that's also very consumer oriented. I mean, we're much more on the professional side, and I've actually counted that the exact opposite is true. Most professional systems who have very extensive UI and UX people built in are not color coded with bright happy colors, do not have rounded edges, do not have, if you look at a lot of the current systems, and I'll throw Adobe out there, or Autodesk, any of those high-end systems where people spend hours and hours, they're very muted colors, they're very contrasty, they're not happy, joy colors.
And maybe not as effective because of it.
I disagree, but that's enough my conversation.
Great. One last question?
Well, coming back to your question, actually, I mean, I think that's a big part of the question is spend that money now on the design aspect because the support and training is going to be minimized, so you're going to save that money. In addition, if it's a good tool, if I'm going to use it, it's going to increase the efficiency of the organization. And then hopefully you don't have to redesign the thing a year later. So that, that may be money well spent at the get-go.
I wish more companies understood that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have to go back to the drawing board every few years.
Well, Microsoft makes money that way, but it's
True.
Some people, that's a business model.
That's a business model. Yeah.
But it's interesting that the default is in one direction, right? The default is not to, rather than to.
Right.
That's, and it'd be interesting to know why that is.
Is it version steps up of happiness?
I don't know. I mean, it sounds like it has more to do with thinking linearly rather than thinking more associatively.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to our panel.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your
Prepping for our second.
And this video will be